there's a lot going on in this arena of multipolarity, and I'm wondering your thoughts about it.
Well, briefly, with respect to Russia, I think it is very important to understand that the Russians didn't turn their backs on Europe, at least not in their own conception. Europe and the West turned their backs on them. They didn't want them in Europe. They didn't want them in the West. At the best, they saw Russia purely as a place where they could extract raw materials and, benefit from it in that kind of a way, but very much the Wild East that they didn't really want to bring into Europe, into the West, into the garden that Josep Borrell and Robert Kagan and people like that talk about. And I think what has happened is that the moment of real revelation of this came over the period of Putin's presidency, because Putin, when he first became president, was somebody who was very committed to integrating Russia into the EU and the West. If you look at his early speeches and early commentaries, the people he made his friendships with, wasn't with Xi Jinping's, wasn't with, Hu Jintao or someone like that. It was with people like the German Chancellor at that time, Schröder. It was with Jacques Chirac. It was with Berlusconi. He was courting people in Europe. And that was very much the attitude and the opinion amongst most Russians, and certainly amongst most elite Russians. What has happened, and the Ukrainian crisis has catalyzed this, is that gradually they became more and more disillusioned. And then over the Ukrainian crisis, and especially over the last 2 years, they finally said, look, this isn't working. It is never going to work. They don't like us. We're going to have the door slammed in our faces every time. This has been the story of Russian-European relations going back all the way to Peter the Great. I mean, when he came to Europe, they treated him as a savage, basically. And if you read accounts of Peter's famous embassy from the perspective of Western observers, that is pretty much as how they saw him. So the Russians are saying to themselves, enough's enough. Let's start engaging with other countries. And what they've discovered is that they're treated in a completely different way. And also, and this is, I think, the great revelation that the Russians now have, they've discovered that those other countries, China, the Koreas, South and North, especially South, because they've had very good relations with the South, Vietnam, they are actually as developed, as advanced technologically, industrially, far more so than the Europeans are. They have far more to offer. Not only are the Russians welcome there, but it's no longer a case that forging a relationship with China is like forging a relationship with a country that the Russians have been incessantly told is backward and primitive or something of this kind. And I think this has been, for the Russians at least, a liberating experience. And I don't think this is something that in the West people fully understand, that they find for the first time that they're dealing with people who respect them and like them and remember a lot of what the Soviet Union did, which was positive during the Cold War, in India, in Africa, in Latin America, in those sort of places. But also countries that have everything that Russia needs and more, to an even greater extent than the old countries in Europe did. So this has been a liberating moment, and it's not, the Russians are not going back on this. Now, as for the rest, well, China, of course, is developing. India, in a completely different way, is also developing. Countries like Vietnam, like other places around the world, Africa appears to be coming together. Latin America is now starting to assert itself in ways that it never did. And by the way, the Russians are now working to agree visa-free travel for Latin Americans to Russia, which is quite a big thing. Anyway, this is inevitable. This is history. We cannot imagine the idea that the world will be a world forever dominated by a small group of countries gathered on each side of the North Atlantic is profoundly anti-historical. It is simply wrong. And this is ultimately what multipolarity is. And the great tragedy and the great disaster is that the European countries and the Americans, very accustomed to this period of about 300, 400, 500 years of Western dominance, which is a short period in terms of human history, find it very, very difficult to accept this and are trying to push back on it and are using the still very considerable power that they actually have to try to prevent it happening and to turn it back. And that is both dangerous and it is misguided. It will either fail completely or it will result in a catastrophe, a human catastrophe, which one doesn't want to imagine.
I think that is very well said. I agree with all of that. The comment about how liberating this is for Russia, I think that is spot on. And it's very important for people to understand that the West has this concept that they are so superior because when they go around the world, unfortunately, so many times the ruling circles in these countries do look up to the West. I know that's the case in Southeast Asia, although it's changing. This is changing and it is liberating. I think it's liberating for all of these countries to realize the West, there is nothing fundamentally special about the West. They have accumulated all of this power and wealth, and that is why they're standing above everyone else. But as other nations begin developing technology, developing their economies and their military, we see that even greater things are possible because there's just so many more people in these other countries, India, China, Eurasia in general. And then I think we will see the same come out of Africa and South and Central America. So that's one really important thing to keep in mind. The other important thing to keep in mind is that these circles of power in the West, they see themselves as superior. They see everyone else as inferior. They do not see them as partners. They pretend that they do when they go to visit them, although this is very thinly veiled sometimes. President Joe Biden in Vietnam talking about what did he call it? Did he call it the third world? I think he might have called it the third world. So very thinly veiled act that they see these other nations as equal partners. They do not. They see them as inferior. They see them as nations that should be subjugated beneath them. Or Alexander, as you were talking about India in a recent video with Alex, in America's orbit, India should be in America's orbit. So this is unacceptable. Everyone should find this unacceptable. And I think the promise of multipolarism is to create a system where nations are dealing with each other as equal partners, and this master and subordinate, this formula that the West for generations has applied, this no longer applies.
The garden and the jungle. That's what I'm seeing in the chat. The garden and the jungle. And didn't what did Sarah Ashton Cirillo say when she was getting punked by Vovan and Lexis? She said that the Russians, like justifying her going after journalists and going after Russians, she said the Russians are not European. They're descendants of Mongols, or they're Asians. She said something like that. I know I'm messing up.
Asians.
Yeah, she said they're descendants of Mongols and they're Asians. Yeah, she said something like that. But you know that reveals what she's listening to. You know, she's getting these talking points from someone, from some people. And so this is how they see things. And you know, to put it simply, the collective West, they really messed up because all the countries that they've sanctioned, all the countries that they've disrespected, colonized, or pillaged from, they're all coming together now. This is this is going to be a problem for the collective West.
Well, if I could just read off. Oh, sorry, Brian.
Well,
Jump
I
in.
was just going to say, I think the biggest concern in the West regarding China's rise, other than their hegemony evaporating, is the comeuppance that they have coming to them. They're just worried, what if China does to us what we've done to them for so long? You know, they're not really looking forward to finding out.
Well, I wanted to read the statement that you were referencing, Alex, from Sarah Ashton Cirillo. I think she's been deposed, right? She's been.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, it's fine.
She's back already.
Whatever she was, it was very strange. The spokesperson for the armed forces. But she said Russians are not Europeans. Russians are Asian. Ultimately, they do come from the Mongols. So, Alex, you were correct. She did mention the Mongols. They do come from a grouping of people who want to be slaves and want to be led, just as it was from the days of Genghis Khan. I wish the rest of Europe and the Western world understood that Europe ends at Ukraine. We're protecting European values and Western values the same way those did hundreds and thousands of years ago when Mongols came in. So pretty picture perfect image of what people like this are thinking. But perhaps last on this note, the Syria-China strategic partnership, if you just give your comments on this, because it comes as China is being said to be collapsing economically. It comes after Biden's Asia tour was a huge flop. And it also comes as now the neocons are talking about China in relation to Ukraine. But this, the Middle East, the Arab world, the nations within West Asia, there's been a lot of moves of late. This comes in the context of a whole lot of developments there, some current and some just in recent history. So whoever would like to maybe conclude, we can conclude on this note.
Briefly, this is a big thing. Assad going to China is a very, very big thing, because China is, of course, the other big pole of power at the moment, and it is the rising pole. All this talk about China on the verge of collapse, its economy being in pieces. I'm not going to go into the details of this, but let's suffice to say that they're in a much better shape than we are in the West. And anybody who lives in the West, anybody who lives in Britain at the moment, will know exactly what I'm talking about. But anyway, so he's gone to China, and we did a program about this, Alex and I. The point is, it's the first visit he's done where he looks relaxed since the war began. He's brought his wife with him. He's never done that recently. So he's brought his wife with him. They've gone to China. They look relaxed. They look actually happy. It's not tense negotiations and all of this. And that in itself is a big indicator, not just to Assad personally, but to people in Syria, that the worst is now definitely behind us. We're normalizing. And of course, China has the means to normalize the situation in Syria. Now, the Chinese waited, I think, to give this invitation. They wanted, first of all, the rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, because China has good relations with Saudi Arabia. So they didn't want to cause problems with that relationship. And they wanted Syria also to rejoin the Arab League, which of course it has now done. So they wanted to receive this leader of the Arab world, who is now in good standing. They received him in a most interesting way. So Xi Jinping says that he praised Assad's steadfastness and his ability to defend his strength in defending his country. Well, we all know against whom. And of course, it's part of the general Chinese policy of pulling together, taking the various bits of the Middle East, which have been shattered in this kind of way for so long, and starting to put all these various pieces together and to integrate them into this Chinese-led Eurasian system, which the Chinese are so keen to set up. So Syria obviously wants to be part of that. It will help Syria finally to normalize. And of course, for China, it enables China to start to rebuild its positions across the Middle East. China had very strong historic positions in the Middle East. That was where the Silk Road used to run through. People often forget about these things, but in China, they tend not to. And of course, it provides China potentially with access to the land access if they ever wanted to the Mediterranean.
I think that's, I agree with all of that. I think Alexander laid out the steps that China went through in order for this to happen. And it just illustrates the amount of patience and geostrategic thinking that is taking place in Beijing versus the knee-jerk reactions happening in Washington, London, and Brussels. And as Alexander said, China has the means to normalize things with Syria. They have the means to rebuild Syria. Syria needs to be rebuilt. They also need to be connected to a region that is no longer at constant war. Again, provoked by the United States and its allies, deliberately so, to prevent stability, to prevent the region from coming together and moving out from under the shadow of Western hegemony that has been cast over it since the fall of the Ottoman Empire. And so we are watching this take place. This is another stepping stone in a very long process that is not going to happen overnight. I think all of us who have been following geopolitics for a long time, when we heard about BRICS, a lot of people a long time ago used to think that this was going to happen very quickly. It wasn't, but it is happening. And as a matter of fact, I would say back then I thought this would take 20, 30, 40 years to unfold, but it's happening much faster than I thought that it would, especially now. And the irony here is that it's mostly things the West is doing that is creating the catalyst for this to accelerate. I think that is very interesting. I think that's something we have to keep a close eye on.
Yeah, I don't have anything further to add. If there's one country that could solve what the problems that Syria has, it's China. So,
yeah, no, it's we'll definitely have to keep a lookout on all of this. I mean, yeah, as all you said, it's huge. All of these things are huge. They're making China, Russia, making huge inroads in this larger project of a multipolar world. And Brian, as you said, the West has a huge part to play in why this is all occurring, because unlike the Cold War, even if we are in a Cold War 2.0 right now, the range of politics and the range of the ways in which each of these individual countries go about things is quite different. What's uniting all of them and what's growing BRICS, what's growing a lot of these institutions is pressure from the West itself, and the way that the West is really kind of committing a self-destruction as it seeks to maintain hegemony. But I've kept you all a very long time.
I just really one last thing. I just wanted to throw this in. The approach China is taking to the Middle East, because we've always heard about peace in the Middle East. We saw the United States pretending to attempt to broker this peace. And it was always done in a very superficial, disingenuous way. They always said, oh, the Palestinians and the Israelis, they've been fighting since the Bible. It's hopeless. It can't be done. And the peace efforts were always empty, meaningless. And then you see China come in. They begin addressing the socioeconomic and geopolitical fundamentals that were driving this. And most importantly, the West's influence over the region. That was the primary cause for this. And by creating alternatives for these nations to pivot away from this toxic relationship with the United States, this is what's finally allowing peace to begin flourishing in the region. It's very important for people to see through the ideology, the religion, the belief that this is all driven by those things, and see the actual fundamentals that matter and how China is changing those fundamentals to actually create tangible changes and improvement in the region.